Good evening. Welcome this evening in the lecture tonight. My name is Travis Kraker, and I'm your MC for this evening. When Professor Takim asked me to be the MC, I said sure, and then I thought, what does that mean? And then I realized it means manager of celebrities. And there are a number this evening. But just before I introduce them to you, I have been asked to make a couple of announcements. One is, please make sure your cell phones are turned off. If you need a restroom and you're new to the building, they're on this level and the level above us and the basement. And finally, there are refreshments that will be served after the lecture in the back of the room. When Professor Takim asked me to be MC and I realized that he meant manager of celebrities, I thought, well, that's in keeping with my former job description as chair of the Department of Religious Studies. And speaking of chairs of the Department of Religious Studies, the first person to speak tonight will be Professor James Ben, the current chair of Religious Studies. Professor Ben.
Thank you so much, Travis. Hello, good evening, and welcome to McMaster University's historic Convocation Hall for tonight's lecture on Islam and Human Rights. I am James Ben, as he indicated, and I am the chair of the Department of Religious Studies. Our distinguished speaker tonight is Dr. Abdulaziz Sachedina, who will be introduced in a few minutes. Tonight's lecture is sponsored by the Sharjah Chair in Global Islam, a chair which has been located in the Department of Religious Studies since 2009. Our department is home to Canada's leading graduate program in religious studies, and we've been proudly training PhD and MA students since 1966. And in our research and graduate training, the department has exerted unparalleled influence on the academic study of religion in Canada and beyond. The department currently has about 50 graduate students, the majority of them working on their PhDs, supervised by 14 faculty members. Although it has gone through various configurations, identities, and eras from its earliest days, McMaster's graduate program has been divided into three fields: Asian religions, biblical studies, and Western religious traditions. All three fields have made enormous contributions in the form of scholarship by faculty and graduate students, and share an outstanding placement record of McMaster graduates in universities across Canada, the US, and in other parts of the world. And in addition to our graduate program, we also teach thousands of undergraduates across the university every term. With the appointment of the Sharjah Chair in Global Islam in 2009, we have been able to add depth in Islamic studies to our existing departmental strengths, and we have also been able to increase our undergraduate enrollments and offerings in the academic study of Islam. I hope you enjoy tonight's lecture, which is part of the Chair's mission to make significant contributions to the study of Muslim peoples and cultures in the context of globalization and the modern condition. Thank you all very much for coming. You can find out more about the department from our website. You can also find us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter.
Well, the lecture this evening, of course, wouldn't be possible without our host, the Sharjah Chair in Global Islam, and the first appointment to that chair, Professor Liaquat Takim, and I'm going to ask him now to make some comments.
Good evening. It's wonderful to see so many of you attend the second annual Sharjah Chair in Global Islam. The first one was actually 2 years ago when Professor Haddad spoke. Last year I was on sabbatical. It's indeed an honor to be the holder of the Sharjah Chair in Global Islam, a position that was endowed by the Amir of Sharjah, His Highness Dr. Sultan Al-Qasimi. We've all heard of Islamophobia, the anxiety or an anxiety about Islam. An anxiety which is built on the concept of otherness, threat and fear of the other. Muslims have had to live with such stereotypes, especially since 9/11, but they've also had to adapt themselves to the North American milieu. Indeed, for a long time, Muslims were just Muslims living in America or North America. Now, they have become North American Muslims. Muslims have realized that not only their Islamic identity is at stake, but also their North American citizenship is also at stake. Hence, they've tried to create, especially since 9/11, they've tried to create a civic identity. Muslims have tried to be more patriotic, and Muslims have also realized that it's better to speak with rather than about the other. They have moved from the language of conversion to the language of conversation. Indeed, this is what we may call the process of indigenization of North American Islam. Indigenization of North American Islam is the process of identifying, understanding, and relating to the culture, heritage, and history of North America. Indigenization also means to carve out a space for oneself in North American society, being more appreciative of North American values while remaining authentic to Islam. Why, you may ask, do we need this lecture series? The need to project a more accurate image of Islam and to counteract some of the stereotypical images many have about Islam was the real reason why Dean and myself conceived of this idea. As I said, the stereotypical images regarding Islam led to the idea of having an annual lecture series on Islam itself. We wanted to make Islam known both to the academic and non-academic public. The idea was to invite a top scholar every year to address issues which are relevant to the Muslim world. I have known Professor Sachedina for over 40 years. I can confidently say that he's one of the best scholars in Islamic studies. Very few scholars can equal his breadth and depth in Islamic scholarship. The Dean, Dr. Charlotte Yates, will introduce you in a few minutes. However, I would like to say once again, thank you for coming. I hope that you will have a wonderful evening and enjoy the lecture. Thank you.
We are getting closer to the main event. And as Professor Dakim announced, our Dean of Social Sciences, Professor Charlotte Yates, will introduce tonight's speaker, Charlotte.
Good evening, everyone, and it is so wonderful to see so many of you turn out tonight. Thank you very much. Many of you have driven a long way for tonight's lecture, and I know that we won't be disappointed. But let me take a couple of minutes to introduce our distinguished speaker. And I think we're very lucky at McMaster to have the Sharjah Chair in Global Islam because it not only enriches our scholarship, but I think one of our roles in university is to enrich public debate. And a public talk like this is very much about enriching that public debate. So I think after the talk, I'm sure that Professor Sachedina will be willing to take some questions as well. So let me, with pleasure, invite and introduce our guest, Professor Abdulaziz Sachedina, who is well known to many of you, and I'm sure that's why he's drawn such a crowd. He actually, we can take great pride in the fact that he got his PhD at University of Toronto, but tonight I believe is his first visit to McMaster University. He presently is a professor and chair in Islamic Studies at George Mason University in Virginia. But what's most important is not actually, I would argue, his particular academic position, but in fact his extensive publications on important topics around the issue of Muslims in America, the question of Islam, and I think to many, Dr. Sachedina has become an important Muslim voice in America. And that's become more important in post 9/11, but I have to say his publications and his fame tell us that he was an important voice far before that. In 1980, he published a very important book, Islamic Messianianism, and that was the beginning of an extensive publishing career, and he's traveled and researched around the world. So we're very, very honored to have you here, and so I'll pass the podium on after we give you a warm welcome of applause.
Good evening to everyone, and it is indeed my first visit to McMaster University, and It's an honor to speak on the topic that will increase our conversations that we need to engage in. My interest in human rights is not simply academic interest. I'm actively engaged in promoting human rights, especially of the minorities in the Muslim world. And these minorities also include women. They might be larger in number, but they are treated as a minority. So there is a struggle that is double-edged. Whatever way I go, I'm in trouble of some sort. Human rights debate is a debate between religion and secularism. In some ways, the international document was worked out by those who did not want any entanglement with religion. There was an understanding from the very beginning that if we were to engage theologians of different traditions, when the document was being written in the 1940s, then there will be no resolution to an agreement on what exactly constitutes human rights, and who should guarantee it, and whether the government should be engaged in defending the human rights of the citizens, and in what sense, with what instruments they can do that. My thesis tonight is very simple. I started off at the University of Toronto studying classical sources of Islamic studies. I studied theology, I studied law, I studied history. But I saw that all my education in the classical studies was not enough for me to engage my audience in the modern times. I had to make my classical information relevant to my audience in the modern times. Like any other people, Muslim peoples have been going through transition. Modernization has affected them as it has affected many religious communities around the world. When I talk about these matters, when I talk about the rights of the women, I am reminded constantly that until 1960s, University of Virginia did not admit women. 60s is not far away. It's just recent in history. And this is the most enlightened university of United States of America. Every American is proud of University of Virginia. But when you look at the history, it had to go through the changes. Today there are more women enrolled as undergraduate students in University of Virginia than men are. In other words, we have changed the demographic situation by realizing that there are entitlements that reach all human beings, whether they're men or female. They have dignity, and that must be recognized. And they can have same potentials as anyone else can have. And therefore, we have moved in the right direction. In the Muslim world, the challenges are even greater, because the burden of historical Islam is quite heavy. Historical heritage of Islam has created a kind of understanding that blocks any further movement of thought. Classical studies of Islamic studies, especially in law and theology, are those subjects in which there's a kind of a crisis of epistemology. I'm using McIntyre here. Alistair McIntyre talks about it in his book on whose justice, whose rationality, which rationality. In other words, we are struggling to define exactly the parameters of modern human being and what exactly do we need, how relevant religion could be to us. My thesis then is a simple one, exploring the classical tradition to understand, is there something that affords authenticity to the modern Muslims when they regard questions of human dignity, human moral agency, human ability to make those decisions on their own? Are they capable of doing it? Or is the authoritarianism of religion going to dominate their minds for ages to come? How exactly are we going to deal with tradition that prides itself on the use of rationality and yet is overburdened by the heritage that doesn't allow it anymore, as if reason has become suspicious? You can't use it anymore the way we used to do it in the classical age. Because the classical age is the sources, provides me with the sources that I use in my understanding, and I start with the Quran itself. The Quran is a document that speaks about humanity in possession of human dignity, in possession of moral agency. The two pillars of human rights today are this ability of human beings to make a decision on their own. Do they have the freedom to choose their religion? Yes, they do. Do they have the freedom of conscience? Yes, they do, because they can decide what is good for them, what is not good for them. Are human beings empowered to do these things? Has God created them with original ideas, original constitution that helps them to understand what exactly they're supposed to do? Are there purposes for human existence? Are those purposes limited to a particular community, or is it to be extended to all humanity? These are very major questions. And they create tension immediately. Because secularism has downplayed the role of religion as a source of values. There are sources of values in religion. Christianity teaches what human beings is all about. When Christianity talks about human being the image of God, immediately there's a question that you can't destroy this image. You can't disallow this image from having the dignity that it possesses by God's decree, so to speak. In other words, there are value systems that are provided by religion. For pragmatic reasons, secularists denied religion any role in the document that you and I know as International Bill of Human Rights. Because they wanted to keep a distance from any kind of entanglement with ideas that are metaphysical. They wanted to argue there were no foundations for human rights. They still insist. Ignatieff, in our own, Canadian society, we have heard him talking to us, telling us that religion has nothing to do with human rights. In fact, we should keep religion away, because what we are interested in is to promote and to preserve human dignity at all levels. In other words, we are defending human rights without becoming entangled into metaphysics. What I'm looking for is the legitimacy for this document in the Muslim world. Because we need a partnership with our Muslim participants to promote human rights. Because there are endless violence. There is violations of the human rights in the Muslim world that are not reported. For example, the rights of the minorities to proclaim their religion, to practice their religion, to spread their religion. Or we do see there are discriminations against the minorities. How do we overcome that? Can we simply say, this is the requirement of modernity and you better accept it, you better be tolerant people and try to live with other people in a pluralistic society? Can we convince them? This is my question. You're dealing with the people who are saturated with religious ideas. They might not be thoroughly religious, but they are religious-minded. They still look for authenticity, for their own identity to religion. If we are going to speak to them and convince them that this is your call, you need to work and you need to support human rights of your citizens, then we have to make the argument compatible with the tradition that they know so well. And this is Islamic tradition. Islamic tradition has value system that is very much derived from its experience of living with other religions. Islam did not come in the vacuum of religion. chronologically the youngest of the Abrahamic religions. It had the capacity within itself to work out what we call the coexistence aspect of it. Like David Novak tells us in Covenantal Rights, in the Jewish tradition, he speaks about the ability of the Jewish community to strike conversation with other communities, to live with other communities, and to do that in the name of religion. Although we as the chosen people of God have a special mission for the world, but we need to live with other human beings as human beings. And that's what created Jewish response to living in a pluralistic society, in a multi-faith communities. And although there are those elements that still need to be worked out in Jewish understanding of other human beings, you find that the secularism that Jewish tradition has adopted has helped it to become compatible with the modern requirements of coexistence and respecting human beings as human beings, and nothing less than that. Are there resources in Islam that can be really evoked for our understanding of how exactly this human rights is to be worked out? And I start from the Quran itself. This is not my reading of the Quran. I assure my Muslim students here, my Muslim audience, that I'm referring to the Islamic resources, and not only the Quran, but also the commentaries of the Quran, also the tradition of the Quran. When I look at the tradition, it is so obvious to me that there is something underlying the human community, and that's their ability to live together as equals. And that equality is known as human being. In a very beautiful tradition, in one of the most important compilations in the Muslim compilations of tradition, Sahih Bukhari, the Prophet is sitting with his own companions, and the Jewish body, the Jewish funeral is passing. And he stands up in respect of the Jewish bier that is passing. His companions are saying, but he's Jewish. That means he doesn't have the same dignity. Apparently this is in the mind. That's not what they're saying. But this is what in their mind. You don't have to stand for Jewish persons passing by. And look at the answer that is preserved in the most authentic tradition. The Prophet is reported to have said, Alaysa huwa al-insan? Isn't he a human being? In other words, there is an identity that precedes religious identity. There is something more important about human existence. And that identity is connected with the human dignity. And nobody has a right to deprive other human being of his or her dignity. And this is where I enter my discussions. That, all right, then, what is it exactly in the Quran that I can cite? This is a tradition. People can say, this is not an authentic tradition. My students might argue with me that, oh, this might have been circumstantial. It might not have been meant to be a normative situation. It can't be used as a principle. Then I go to the Quran itself. When I go to the Quran, I read this verse, لَقَدْ قَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ وَحَمَلْنَاهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ. This is a very important verse of the Quran, that we have honored all children of Adam. This karramna is translated as we have dignified all human beings. I'm not making it up. This is my argument with traditional scholars in the Muslim world who are refusing to recognize the Quranic verse. I'm confronted with the Muslim world in which the traditional scholars are saying, and listen to this, human rights document is an imposition from the secular world, and it is claiming universality, that we as Muslims should practice it, should administer it. And we are not going to do it, because we have our own universality. In other words, there is a challenge for the traditional society, for the traditional authorities in the Muslim world. And this is, by the way, the centers of the learning. Al-Azhar in Cairo, other places, they are talking about these issues. Now, I'm talking about traditional authority. I'm not talking about modern thinkers in the Muslim world who are thinking like me. My task has been to convince and sit in conversation with traditional leaders. Why would I do that? Why do I need to do that? Because if I cannot convince them, I have not convinced the masses. The masses are still following the traditional authorities. And they will continue to do that unless the traditional authorities change their views about human beings. I'm just, hitting the hard rock. And there's nothing that I can do to change it. In other words, my struggle has been to use the classical sources that the traditional authorities are recognizing as these sources, and to tell them that, please reread what I'm reading. It's very interesting. I was invited in Iran, and there was discussion about pluralism. I'm talking about 1980s, by the way. To be exact, it was 1999, actually, that I was invited to speak in Qom, which is a center of Shia learning in Iran. And the conference was about pluralism in religion. The whole idea was coexistence. If we do not increase our understanding of other human beings having equal dignity and having equal worth of being respected as human beings first, then we are in trouble in the modern world. Because we are living in a modern nation state. Modern nation state is involved in creating what I call citizenship. In citizenship, there is no boundary of religion. Whereas Islamic law looks at the human being saying that there are believers and there are non-believers. These laws apply to the believers, they don't apply to the non-believers. But the non-believers do not share the same level of equality. This is where the law comes. Now, if you're dealing with that kind of understanding about the religious law, about the sacred law, then you are confronted with an issue. Then how exactly are you going to convince them about what you are reading? So my reading has been really a kind of a challenge to the traditional leaders, that how exactly should we read the sources again? Because this hermeneutics in the sources is the source of my understanding of how Muslims can legitimize the international document. International document, although it is secular, it is very much based on the understanding that human beings have basic decency. They have been given, they have been empowered with a rational capacity. They can make their decisions according to their own rational judgment, and they can do anything that they want to do as far as they are within the limits of the civic existence. Religious language is a different language. I'm inside the religious community or I'm outside the religious community. How can that religious community expand its boundaries so that others become acceptable to it? Not as less humans, but as equal humans. And that's the challenge, by the way. And this is what I needed to work out. So I started looking at the sources with which I could speak to the scholars. I looked for the first time at Islamic theology. My colleagues who have written on human rights have only dealt with jurisprudence. In jurisprudence, Islamic jurisprudence, it's quite clear that Muslims have an upper hand, non-Muslims are not equal to the Muslims. Their rights are circumscribed by the question of membership in the community. And I had to struggle with that first. But once I move on from there, then I need to explore the foundation of Islamic jurisprudence. My thesis has been, and I have pursued it in my new book on Islamic biomedical ethics, that Islamic decisions can be made at the first level, at the level of ethical deliberations. Ethical deliberations are created by a very important understanding in Islamic theology. I'm talking about here theological ethics. By that I mean, are human beings capable of knowing the right from the wrong? There are two theses about it among Muslims. There are those Muslims who are the majority, by the way, who believe that there is divine command ethics. We don't know what is good and what is bad. Only God determines for us through His commandments what is good and what is bad. In other words, we have no way of knowing good from evil. Only God makes it clear for us. This is known as divine command ethics, and the larger Sunni community all believe that God gives values to our actions. So whatever God commands has to be good. Whatever God forbids has to be evil. So good and evil are defined in those terms. But there is also a splinter group within the Sunni community who are rationalists and naturalist theologians who believe that God had endowed human beings with a nature that is capable of knowing the right from the wrong without the revelation coming to its aid. This is what we know as objective good and objective evil. Even if I have never heard any prophet preaching, I still am held accountable in the Quran for my knowledge of right from the wrong. In other words, I do have moral knowledge about good and evil, for which I'm accountable. And if I push the thesis, by the way, across and bring it to the modern times, then what I'm discovering is that there is already inbuilt secularity in Islam. There's inbuilt functional secularity in Islam. Remember, of the three Abrahamic religions, Christianity did not establish its own government until it was adopted by the government in the 3rd century. Judaism was always a minority that lived under different governments. Therefore, it did not really develop what I'm talking about. Muslims had to develop it from within their own resources because they were ruling an empire made up of different communities, different ethnic groups, different religious groups. In Baghdad, there were Jewish quarter, Muslim quarter, Christian quarter. In major cities of the Islamic world, there were Jewish people and Christian people and Muslim people living together and running their businesses together. And yet, there was an understanding between them. Religious communities, minorities were self-governing bodies, but they did not have the same rights as Muslims had. They were discriminated against. In Baghdad, for instance, we read in the 8th, 9th centuries, Muslims could build 2-story buildings, but non-Muslims could not. Muslims could ride horses, but non-Muslims could not. In other words, you have a clear discrimination going on. And yet there was this instinctive requirement from the Quran itself. There could be salvation in Judaism, there could be salvation in Christianity, and Islam is also one of the 3 major peoples of the book. In other words, there was some kind of equality in spiritual matters. The Quran did not deny the Jews to be saved in their own tradition. It did not deny Christians to be saved in their own tradition. It recognized the self-efficacy of other traditions. And yet, it did recognize that the Muslim community was now in power. Therefore, it could determine the value system of the society as a whole. So you do find the laws dealing with it. The laws telling us what Christians could sell in public, what they could not sell in public, what Jews could do in public, what they could not do in public. All these things are part of the legal tradition. And the legal tradition is very much in alignment with the political power. Because the political power is Muslim power, and therefore the discrimination is properly institutionalized. But not the Quran, not the tradition itself. The Quran laid down quite clearly that no, not only salvation was possible, but there was equality in creation. If the equality in creation is recognized of all human beings, then human beings must have their rights. Now, the rights language, by the way, is modern language. It's not classical language. Classical language is entitlements and responsibilities. That's the classical language. If you have rights, then you have responsibilities. And many times, rights are assumed under your performance of responsibilities. If you do this first, then you automatically have right to do this. But you must fulfill your obligations first. So it is in a way a discursive discourse where you find that there is a balance between rights and the duties that is being worked out by the religious system. But that's not the way the modern secular language of human rights is designed. Human rights language is designed to tell us individuals have rights regardless of their affiliation in any community. There are no externals. There are no external circumstances that can circumscribe my rights as an individual. I am the one who has the right, I am the holder of the rights, simply as a matter of fact that I happen to be a human being. Human being as a human being has a right. What we find, for example, in the traditional scholarship of Islam, there was clearly a distinction made between Muslim and non-Muslim. Muslims have automatic rights. Non-Muslims have no automatic rights unless they fulfill those obligations within the taxation system. They were taxed. There was tolerance tax they paid in order to be tolerated in the Muslim society, in order for them to work in the Muslim society. In other words, there were issues that had to be resolved. And the major issue to be resolved was the equality of men and women. Traditional societies were patriarchal societies, where women were in the pre-Islamic Arabian system, the Arabian tribal system, women were almost regarded as the property of the tribe. That had to change. How was that going to change if woman was not given the same status as a man? Where could this debate begin? The debate began, first of all, in the endowment of the nature. If if God was the creator of everyone, would he discriminate against one sex and give all to the male sex and deprive the female sex of it? And that question was debated. And it was debated in the Quranic commentaries. The Quranic commentaries began to look at the whole idea of where do women stand? Because the status of women in the 7th century anthropology of the Quran, they were in a tribal system. They were in a different culture. As the society was progressing, there was a different understanding of the role of the women. How are they going to be afforded equality with men when the society was still patriarchal society? But it's very interesting that the Prophet's own life had matriarchal system in Medina. Yathrib was matriarchal. Mecca was patriarchal. And therefore the women had far more greater voice in the Medinan system, because they were in control not only of the membership of the tribe. Even the Prophet's father was selected by Prophet's mother from Medina. In other words, there was this kind of understanding in the Medina society. This is what was meant by matrilineal. Mothers were important, women were important. How was that balance to be achieved in the new tradition, which was somehow undoing? It was saying that we need to dismantle the tribal system in order for the new system to take root. The new system was going to be لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. All human beings are honored by God. No distinction made between men and women. In fact, the Quran did not even repeat the Genesis story in which Eve was blamed for what happened to Adam. It did not. The Quran put the blame on men and women together. You both were misled. You both were misled by Satan. You both were, had to leave the paradise because of this. In other words, the Quran made both men and women responsible for what was happening to them and what future would lie for them. In other words, there was enough material in the Quran to suggest that, no. If this is what the Quran is talking about, the Quran is saying that we have inspired all human beings with the knowledge of right and wrong. This is what I call the ethical epistemology of the Quran. How do I know what I know? This is right, this is wrong. Then I discover very clearly that the Quran was clear that, no, God has inspired all human beings with the same ability. If there is same ability, there is same capacity, how can there be difference then between men and women? So we understand from the anthropology and sociology of Islam, and our legal authors were sociologically and anthropologically responding to the needs of the society. Does it mean then that the subject of discussion has changed? And we need to change the situation also so that we can derive the new decisions about it. This has been my struggle and my argument with the traditional scholarship. For the first time, when I discussed pluralism in Iran, in Qom, it became clear to me that there was a need to read the verses of the Quran that spoke about pluralism, that endorsed pluralism as something that is divinely ordained. وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ عَلَى شَرِيعَةٍ فَاتَّبِعْهَا. We have appointed for you the normative system, you follow it. But then it came forward and says, for every community we have appointed a Sharia. We appointed a law for them. And if God had willed, you would have made all community, all people as one member of one religious community, but he did not do that. In the meantime, what the Quran meant was that you can never resolve theological differences. But what you will be able to resolve is that you all need to work towards one goal. فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ إِلَى اللَّهِ مَرْجِعُكُمْ جَمِيعًا. You compete with one another in doing good. You're all going to return to God, and God will judge you what you have done in this world. In other words, we don't have the capacity to continue the conflict forever. There could be no endless conflicts for human society. There has to be a way in which human beings should learn to live with one another. So there are issues then that can be resolved within the tradition itself. But that tradition, if it is controlled by a certain kind of leadership, we can never see those changes coming in. And this is where the struggle lies. And my thesis is very simple, as I said, that I'm going back to the classical sources to make a point that the classical sources are clear enough for me to formulate human rights debate within the community and then ask the community to provide legitimacy for the international document. Because in my opinion, international document is not only fair, and I do know that there is cultural relativism, and I do accept it, because value system is applied in different cultures at different times. And certainly, I think there's no reason to doubt that, that human rights scholars in the 1940s, those who sat in San Francisco and endorsed the human rights document, they were clearly coming from the Western understanding of democracy and what liberal society means. They did not know other societies. Other societies were under their colonial control. There was colonialism still in the whole world at that time. In other words, they had very little understanding of the Muslim peoples, whom they were controlling. Either they were controlled by the French, or the Dutch, or the British. In other words, all of them were, had divided the whole world under their own control. We're talking about 1940s. It is not until 1960s when African countries become independent. And then the situation changes. So under the colonial rule, they had one way of dominating, and they dominated through one kind of universalism. What they forgot was that Christianity has its own universalism. Judaism has its own universalism, which is based on justice, by the way. They are the first people to speak about justice. We have inherited from them their argument to support justice. And also the Muslims have their own universalism. Does it mean that the two universalism, one worked out by the secular advocates of human rights, and the one claimed by the traditional scholars of Islam, from Islam, do they need to be in conflict, or can there be a conversation between them? I'm suggesting simply conversation. I've not been able to convince everyone to whom I speak. I've not been able to convince everyone, but I do know that I gave seminar, I taught a course for the first time on Islam and human rights in Mashhad University, in the Faculty of Theology. which is a breakthrough. You would never be allowed to do that. This was under Khatami's presidency, by the way, when Muhammad Khatami was the president of Iran. I taught that course, and by the way, 78% of the students were women who were trying to understand what are their rights under the system. And surely there's a lot of debate and discussion that should be handled by the authorities. But the other issue is that I was also able to present my thesis about human rights and pluralism among the traditional scholars in Qom. I was invited for 3 days in Iran to teach that course, by the way. And what I spoke about was the universal dimension of ethics and how ethics can deliver us what law cannot do it. But what I meant was that law uses ethics because there is no way that as a jurist I would make a decision without considering the moral pros and cons of the decision I'm going to make for any case that I'm referred to. If I'm going to tell a woman who comes and asks me, can I perform abortion because I come from a poor family, I already have 6 children and I can't take care of them anymore. This is the 7th pregnancy, what should I do? Then I would consider something that is very important, and this is the inviolability of the embryo. Is it there? Do Islamic sources speak about it or not? Does she have a right to make a decision against her husband's decision? There's another aspect of it. Can she do it herself? Does this body belong to her, or is it a common property between her and her spouse? What exactly are the limits? You can see the complexity of the issues that we're dealing with. When you're talking about the rights, you're also talking about the rights of the embryo. Does the embryo have a right to come into this world? What kind of rights does it have? Because Islamic law says an embryo, a fetus, has a right to inherit. Depending on the age of the fetus can inherit. So if the property can, be assigned to the fetus, why not, other rights that accrue as legal personality would have? And we are discussing and debating these issues. In other words, we are talking about a field that is very broad. Not only the rights of the citizens. I was working on the Iraqi constitution. I come to this subject very closely connecting myself to the decision makers. Because I worked very closely as an advisory, in the advisory group of the Iraqi constitution. And I'll be remembered all the time for my contribution. And I reveal to you what was my contribution. The law, the new constitution of Iraq was saying that all the laws of the nation or this country will be under the Sharia oversight. I said no. I said no, it can't be that. Unless you define for me what you mean by Sharia. If you mean the schools of law, then there is a Sunni minority here living. There's a Christian community living. If you're talking about the Sharia that was inherited from the past, the juridical corpus, then you're making a mistake. You can use Sharia as a source of norms, values, principles, but you can't use the past Sharia to run a modern nation state which requires citizenship, which requires a source of equality among its citizens. The moment you bring in the juridical corpus of the past, you are creating discrimination. Not only that, you will be creating discrimination also within the families.